Everybody loves to talk about Borderlands 2 versus Borderlands 3, or how Borderlands 3 is the worst thing to happen to Borderlands. But among these debates, there's one game that goes relatively unmentioned: Borderlands The Pre-Sequel. The Pre-Sequel had a bunch of really cool concepts that it came out with, but it also has some pretty big drawbacks that bring it down quite a bit. Hey Vault Hunters, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is the good, the bad, and the ugly of Borderlands The Pre-Sequel. If you enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel. And if you're looking for more Borderlands content, consider joining me live on YouTube. I live stream every Saturday to Tuesday from 6 PM EST until whenever I feel like it. I'll see you there. Borderlands The Pre-Sequel did a lot of stuff right. One of the most praised things about the game is its characters' skill trees. Skill trees in the two games leading up to the Pre-Sequel had been relatively simple so far, with the exception of Krieg. Most of the skills were just this stat goes up, or killing a person gives more of this stat kind of deal. Sure, Borderlands 2 had some decently ambitious skills like Grit, Scorn, and Bore, but a large majority of that game's skills just increased a stat that was helpful to the Vault Hunter in some way. And the same is true with the original Borderlands, where the most unique skills in that game were Lilith's Phoenix or Mordecai's Trespass. In the Pre-Sequel, the skill trees are a lot more unique than that. You've got entire trees dedicated to dealing increased elemental damage and giving you extra ways to deal that damage, or trees dedicated to giving all sorts of cool buffs to non-elemental weapons to make them on par with the correct element. The skill trees in Borderlands The Pre-Sequel were less about getting the highest damage stat or maximizing your survivability, and more about creating interactions and using those interactions to completely slaughter your enemies. Don't get me wrong, there are skills in the Pre-Sequel that are just an increase to stats, but they are certainly fewer and further between than in the previous installments. The skill trees in this game are closer to Borderlands 3 skill trees than they are to Borderlands 1 or 2, which is very much a good thing. This is a game where you can get every single capstone for your character, and yet somehow it has a crazy amount of build diversity. One more little tidbit that I would like to add in this game's favor was that the Pre-Sequel is the only game that counts 1 point in your halfway skill as enough to move to the next tier, which I thought was a really cool addition. DLCs are a pretty substantial part of Borderlands games, adding all sorts of new guns, weapons, and characters, and even storylines in most cases. Borderlands has a reputation for amazing DLCs. The Armory of General Knox, Claptrap's new Robot Revolution, Captain Scarlet and her Pirate's Booty, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep, and many, many more awesome DLCs that give Borderlands a name for great add-on content. The Pre-Sequel unfortunately didn't get much in terms of DLCs, only getting one slaughter map, 2 characters, and 1 story DLC. However, the quality of that story DLC is absolutely insane. I don't know if I could say it's my absolute favorite Borderlands DLC of all time, but the Claptastic Voyage DLC is at the very least in the top 3. Gearbox has been very good at exploring themes of mental illnesses in their DLCs, and Claptastic Voyage is no exception to that. In this DLC, we venture inside of a claptrap to acquire something called the H-Source, and while venturing through this claptrap, we get to see the world as Claptrap sees it. This DLC, after 15 years of hating Claptrap, finally made me feel actually kinda sympathetic for him, which is really saying something. Given how amazing the first DLC for this game was, it makes me pretty sad that we only ever got 1 story DLC from this game. Balance in Borderlands games is always a touchy subject, with half of the game suffering pretty heavily from balance issues to this day. After the balancing nightmare of Borderlands 2, I was just kind of expecting more of the same from this game. However, much to my delight, the balance of the Pre-Sequel is actually a lot more based in reality. In Borderlands 2, even at Ultimate Vault Hunter mode without OP levels, the amount of weapons you could use reliably was very limited. In the Pre-Sequel, you have so many different options for guns, shields, and grenades that you can use, and you very rarely feel limited in your options. The same can be said for the skills and skill trees as well. Sure, there are skills and trees that are more powerful than other ones, but at almost no point did I ever feel like a certain skill tree was just a bad option overall, with one exception. The Pre-Sequel did have some pretty serious scaling issues overall, which I will get into later in the video, but overall, the game just felt way more fair in terms of balance. It never really felt like either side was given way too much power, which can't really be said for Borderlands 2 or 3. This, of course, is helped quite a bit by the removal of the ridiculous health regen in Ultimate Vault Hunter mode for the Pre-Sequel. But even going through normal and true Vault Hunter mode, the Pre-Sequel was just overall better balanced in every regard. The Vault Hunters were all strong and had loads of different builds, most of the weapons felt powerful enough to use, and even most Oz kits and class mods had a use to some degree. Balance for Borderlands has very much been a 50-50 split, but the pre-sequel got its balance right for sure. Iridium in Borderlands 2 was a pretty neat concept. Giving us a secondary currency to spend on special items seemed like a great idea. However, the problem in Borderlands 2 arose when the special items we could purchase with this secondary currency were of limited quantity, and once we ran out of them to buy, Iridium was pretty much worthless. And yes, you could spend anywhere from 8 to 99 Iridium to fight a raid boss, but that was its only use. The pre-sequel, on the other hand, had a load of options for your Iridium equivalent moonstones. Not only did you have the ammo SDU upgrades that could be bought with them, you also had chests that require moonstones to open that would always give you better loot. You had moxtails for purchase at the up over bar, and you could use the moonstones to guarantee the best loot possible when using the grinder, which causes other issues that we will get into later, in addition to using them to fight the game's raid boss. This immediately solved the issue with not having enough uses for the secondary currency in this game, and made moonstones feel less pointless after the first 2 playthroughs. Writing is something that Borderlands 2 gets a lot of praise for, and honestly, the pre-sequel's writing is also pretty fantastic as well. Not just the main story though. I mean, the main story is good, but even the side characters feel very well written despite being left a little underdeveloped. The writing does start admittedly slow, and it doesn't really feel meaningful until about the 40% mark of the story, which kinda sucks, but I spent a good deal of time laughing as I played through this game. Now, humor and writing are subjective, so a story I enjoy may not be one you enjoy, but I can certainly say I very much enjoyed the writing of the pre-sequel. Just a couple of quick fire points here. Lasers were a super fun addition to the game. Even though I wasn't particularly fond of railguns and blasters, I found splitters and beams very cool to play around with. The redesign of relics in this title into Oz kits was really well done, and in most cases Oz kits actually felt better than relics in my opinion. And additionally, the post-launch support of this game was super important for keeping this game relevant and fixed a large portion of the game's major early launch issues, which we will talk about later. Well, we've talked about the goods. Let's move on to the bads. Starting with the maps. The maps in this game are awful. Flat out. I get that it's the moon, and that it would naturally be pretty big and empty, but these maps just really suck. Every single zone that is on Elpis looks the exact same aside from Concordia, and they're all just big empty spaces filled with Shugaraths and Kragans. I've played through this game quite a few times now, and I still don't know what map I'm in 95% of the time because they all look the damn same. At least the Helios maps look pretty good, but even still, a lot of them are just empty space for the sake of empty space. The map design in Borderlands 1 and 2 were amazing, and although 3 had its issues, I genuinely would rank the maps in the pre-sequel lower than the maps in Borderlands 3. I mean, even Eden 6, the map that is literally all jungle, has more distinctive features than the entire moon in the pre-sequel. Again, I get it, it is literally the moon, but still, there was almost zero attempt to actually make any of the zones on Elpis stand out, and it gets super confusing, especially on your first few playthroughs. Again, Helios maps are a little bit better, though even those maps can get confusing as hell sometimes, but the maps in this game are definitely not its strong suit. Another aspect that the pre-sequel really struggled with was its short story. The story of the pre-sequel is very good. It's well written, serious when it needs to be, and lighthearted when it can be. But holy shit, is it ever short. There are only 12 story missions in this game, which, when compared to the other games in this franchise, is insanely short. Borderlands 2 has 19 story missions, Borderlands 3 has 23 story missions, and even the original Borderlands has 46 of them, though Borderlands 1's story missions are a lot shorter than the other 3's. There are multiple missions in this game that realistically could have and should have been split into multiple different missions. Even with that though, the story is far too short, and more often than not is over before it's even begun. The world record speedrun time for Borderlands 2 is 1 hour, 49 minutes, and 45 seconds with load times removed, held by Dark Smoke 11. The world record speedrun time for the pre-sequel is 1 hour, 39 minutes, and 36 seconds, also held by Dark Smoke 11. And while that may not seem like very much, in speedruns, 10 minutes is absolutely massive. The pre-sequel story was very short, and while some people might even see that as a good thing, there's a lot of avenues that I felt could have been explored more. Even side content is relatively lacking in the pre-sequel, as there's only 61 side missions, whereas in Borderlands 1 there's 109 and in Borderlands 3 there's 91. The short story is for the most part a subjective problem, but it also causes an objectively huge issue, which we will talk about later. Whenever a non-survival game tries to make you manage a resource, it can get pretty annoying. This is exactly what happened in the pre-sequel with oxygen. Once again, I get that we are on the moon, in space, but having that oxygen bar ticking down whenever you're not in an atmosphere gets pretty damn annoying. For the most part, this isn't really too bad, as at least half of the maps are inside or within an atmosphere where you can breathe, but oxygen is a really annoying problem early in the game, as you usually have limited numbers of it. Another huge problem with oxygen is exploration. It is very difficult to get lost in this game's maps and check out potential cool areas when after a minute or two you start dying from oxygen loss. And God forbid you get your car blown up on one of the huge empty Elpis maps we talked about before, as then it just becomes a slow game of running from one oxygen geyser to another. Oxygen is a very strange problem, as 50% of the time I forget it's even a mechanic in this game, and then the other 50% of the time, it's the bane of my existence. Although Claptrap mains might not feel my pain as they don't even need oxygen. The grinder was a pretty neat concept added in the pre-sequel. This new addition gave us something to do with our trash loot besides selling it. The grinder lets you put in 3 weapons into it and will pop out something that could be about the same or better than what you put in. In theory, this is great, a cool new way to get some nice gear. In practice though, it causes all sorts of other issues. At the initial launch of the game, the grinder was one of the only ways to get most of the legendaries in this game, which is again, something we'll talk about later. Even still to this day though, the grinder is very heavily dependent on for certain legendaries. There are many drops in this game today that were given a lower drop chance from its source than from the grinder, just to make us have to use the grinder for it. The grinder also gives you the option to use moonstones to get the best possible option, which creates even more problems that again, we'll talk about later, but that doesn't really fix the issue. Another pretty big problem that I have personally with the grinder is its lack of transparency and consistency. The grinder recipes in this game can get super confusing. You can put a purple shotgun in with 2 legendaries of any type and it will give you a legendary shotgun in exchange for it. But try that with grenades and it won't work. There also isn't any transparency from the game about what recipes do what, so you're relying mostly on Steam guides from over a decade ago. The grinder was a very neat concept, but the game really tried to make it way more important than it should have been. Speaking of legendaries, the drop rates for some of these items are absolutely abysmal. Drop rates in Borderlands games have always been kind of hit or miss, but there are multiple items in the pre-sequel with a 5% or less drop chance for seemingly no reason. The Quasar specifically was a huge problem for me, as its drop chance is only 5% and it drops from the boss at the end of the Titan robot production plant. Another weapon with an absolutely horrible drop rate is the IVF SMG, with only a 3.3% drop chance from the Bosun, another boss that's halfway through another map. I've got a sneaking suspicion that these low drop rates are intentional to incentivize grinder use, but that could just be me. The biggest problem though is the pretty decent amount of gear that still doesn't have a dedicated drop. Although we eventually got dedicated drops and respawning bosses in this game, there are still a lot of weapons without any drop source, like the Maggie, the Hellfire, and the Bada Boom. I understand that there's going to be a few world drop only legendaries, but about a third of the base game weapons don't have drop sources, and about 50% of all other types of items don't have a drop source either. This really makes farming for certain items an absolute pain in the ass. Though at the very least, a lot of items do have drop sources, even if their drop rate is very low. One of the more common complaints regarding the pre-sequel is the lack of post-story content. That's one of the biggest things holding this game back, honestly. There is very little endgame content to be done. There's only 1 slaughter map and 1 raid boss without having the pre-order bonus. There's also only 1 DLC, and despite it being one of the best, more would certainly be nice. The problem isn't just the quantity of the endgame content though, it's also the quality of the endgame content. The only raid boss we have in this game is just the final boss, but with a very high number of health, and again, I appreciate the effort to actually give us a raid boss, but the fact that our only raid boss is the final boss fight but harder, really hurts this game. Additionally, the only included slaughter map in this game is also just really bad in my opinion. Conceptually, it's a neat map that changes while you're playing through it, however the map is absolutely massive and there are so few enemies in the map. Playing through the Holodome slaughter map reminds me of playing through the dungeons in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. More often than not, I have to spend 5 minutes between enemies just to find another enemy to kill. The Holodome is cool and a fun map, but the amount of enemies on it is almost nothing for its size. So to recap, the endgame content for this game is the final boss but harder, and a very slow paced and boring slaughter map. Which means that unless you like just cycling the story over and over, there's almost nothing to do after you've beaten the game. Another relatively small issue with the pre-sequel is Aurelia's contractual aristocracy skill tree. This skill tree, for the unaware, is Aurelia's red tree, which relies almost entirely on having a co-op partner be in a contract with you for various buffs to you and the contractee. This decision really limits Aurelia's solo play, as one entire skill tree is made worthless by not playing with someone. Luckily, there's only one skill tree like this, and despite what people tell me about Claptrap, even most of his skills are beneficial for solo play. Alright, we've talked about the good, we've talked about the bad, now let's talk about the ugly. No, not Pickle. He is annoying, but he doesn't make the game objectively worse. The first major issue with the pre-sequel is the moonstone economy. I mentioned earlier that the secondary currency, moonstones, in this game have way more uses. However, those uses add up very quickly, and moonstones are still relatively rare. It's not even so much that moonstones are rare, but the fact that they're still capped at 500. Moonstone grinds, which are one of the best ways to get legendary world drops, cost around 70 moonstones per grind, which means that you only get 7 grinds out of the maximum amount of moonstones you can have. There's also moonstone chests, which I talked about before, but these cost 40 moonstones to open. And then you also have the SDUs that cost 210 moonstones to max out one ammo type, which usually leaves me completely ignoring all other uses for moonstones until damn near the end of the game. Moonstone uses are way too expensive in my opinion, and it makes moonstones super useful, but they just don't drop often enough, and stop adding up after 500, meaning you can't really stockpile them at all. It also doesn't help that moonstones don't auto pick up, which kinda sucks. First impressions are important. Everyone knows that. Matter of fact, first impressions are a huge part of the reason why this game did so poorly. When the pre-sequel launched, dedicated drops were few and far between, and most bosses didn't even respawn. This left a lot of Borderlands fans very disappointed, as dedicated drops were one of the best additions to Borderlands 2, but they got removed in this entry. There were also a bunch of launch day bugs where people were getting stuck or falling through the floor for seemingly no reason. The initial launch of the pre-sequel left a bad taste in a lot of early players' mouths, which really hurt its reputation overall. And there's still people who, even to this day, don't know that bosses respawn now and that dedicated drops have mostly come back. There are quite a few issues that can really hurt people's enjoyment of the pre-sequel, but by far, the worst issue with this game is its level pacing. The level pacing of the pre-sequel is absolutely atrocious. The story being short really makes this problem way worse, as there's only 12 story missions, yet the level you're expected to be at the end of normal mode is level 28, meaning that the game expects you to be getting about 2 levels between every single story mission. And while at first that seems pretty easy, and even by the first 3 missions being done you're already level 10, experience gain slows down significantly around the time you fight the bosun. Multiple times throughout the main quest in both normal and true Vault Hunter mode, you'll be required to stop what you're doing to go farm side quests or the Darksiders or whatever story boss you fought last to keep yourself appropriately leveled for the missions. This has been a problem before in the past. In Borderlands 1, you basically had to do all of the side missions available to you before fighting Bonehead, and in Borderlands 2, especially in true Vault Hunter mode, experience was pretty hard to come by. But in the pre-sequel, the experience scarcity is taken up to a whole new level. Many times I would beat a story mission at say level 16, only to start the next story mission and have it be level 18 or 19 for seemingly no reason. And as we already talked about, there's so few side quests that even doing every side quest, you're still going to be struggling for experience throughout the story. This additionally means that your weapons are going to be falling off pretty much every single time you move on to the next story mission. So on top of farming for experience after every mission, you have to farm for gear as well, or just roll with under-leveled gear and get completely stomped. While the experience drought is bad in normal mode and true Vault Hunter mode, and stops you from getting really invested in the story, where it becomes an even bigger issue is once you've finally beaten Ultimate Vault Hunter mode and now want to get to max level. There is no good level farm in this game, so your options are either kill the same boss 1,000 times to do it, or repeat the first story mission over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Between those two methods, getting from level 48 to level 70, so 22 levels, took me just under 10 hours to do. Levels in this game are just way too few and far between, and it really kills not only the momentum and immersion of the story, but also just the overall fun of the game. Luckily, if you're on PC, you can use the unofficial patch which doubles experience gains in Ultimate mode, but if you're on console, you're shit out of luck. And that also doesn't fix the random jumps in levels in normal or true Vault Hunter modes. The level pacing of the pre-sequel is by far one of the most annoying problems with the game, and even outrivals Borderlands 2's level pacing, which up until now I thought was by far the worst. The pre-sequel did quite a few things wrong, but it also got a pretty decent amount right. Would you like to see this style of video for the other Borderlands games? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching, have a fantastic day.